for deciding to be with us this Monday morning. And Matthew Namee, he is a counterpart of mine, the closest colleague I can think of, because his website, Orthodox History, promotes the same values as my website, Historical Studies of the Russian Church Abroad. What do I mean those values? It's mean value of historical analysis, of studying picture in its complexity without excluding those things that don't fit our agenda, don't fit our modern perception. So without any delays, I'd like Matthew to take the floor and to continue with introduction, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Deacon Andre. And just to confirm, you can hear me all right with this microphone?
Yes, I do hear you well. I do hear you well.
Good. Well, and I think we have a couple minutes until we were going to start. So if you did want to give a couple minute break, we can do that.
Right. I mean, yeah. That's
I can before we fully start, I can sort of give a little bit of background on myself. I have been blogging about Orthodox history for over a decade at orthodoxhistory.org. I used to have a podcast on Ancient Faith Radio about American Orthodox history. American Orthodoxy was my original focus of study that I've really spent my entire adult life studying. In recent years, I've expanded that to really look at the whole of modern Orthodox history, not only America, but elsewhere, which is a very understudied area. I think we know a lot about the period of the ecumenical councils. We spend a lot of time studying the first 1,000 years of church history. We don't give as much attention to the modern period, the last couple hundred years, which is really formative. It really informs our understanding of where we are today, but we sort of have forgotten a little bit in some ways. It doesn't get as much attention. So that's where I've focused my work. It sounded like when I got on, you were finishing up a discussion about mission in the Russian church. Is that accurate?
Can you come again, please? Sorry.
It sounded like when I logged in, you were finishing up a discussion about mission in the Russian church. Is that right?
I was covering the Russian imperial missions elsewhere, but in the States in the 19th century.
Okay, and so yeah.
We covered it together with Otец Andrei, who is a Russian priest from Madrid. So
wonderful.
Who has been with us since the beginning.
So I'll try to bring really quickly us up to the period that we're going to talk about today, which is the period beginning in around 1890. Prior to 1890, you had, of course, Orthodoxy in Alaska, and it had been there in an organized fashion for around 100 years. But for the rest of what we think of as the United States outside of Alaska, the lower 48, there was no organized Orthodoxy at all in the for the first half of the 19th century.
No.
The
do not come in here.
I would like everyone to turn their mics off, that we won't hear whatever goes on your end. Translation, please.
Okay. The cats also have a strong interest in the discussion. Huh?
Yes. So, sorry.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. I wasn't sure if it was something with my microphone or with the audio there. So we had pockets of Orthodox people in the major cities in the United States during the first half of the 19th century, but nothing that was really organized. So you had Orthodox people largely in port cities. These were merchants, typically, a number of Greeks and Serbs, virtually no Russians to speak of in the first half of the 19th century in North America, outside of Alaska. But we had the beginnings of organized Orthodoxy in America in the 1860s. You had a church in New Orleans, and New Orleans was at the time one of the major port cities in the United States. There was a church organized there in the 1860s, and it was connected with the Church of Greece. And it was very loosely connected, but it was connected with the Church of Greece. It was had Greeks and Serbs primarily. And then you had in San Francisco at exactly the same time, there was a church organized in San Francisco. Now, this church was organized in direct connection with the Russian diocese in Alaska. And in 1867, when Alaska was sold to the United States, the Russian church in San Francisco became the cathedral. It was the cathedral seat was transferred, which was technically not even on diocesan territory, which was interesting. And even though it was a Russian cathedral, it was, as the New Orleans church was, it was almost entirely Greeks and Serbs. There were some Antiochians, but there weren't actually very many Russians. But there was the Russian cathedral in San Francisco. There was also, shortly after this, in 1870, they established a church in New York. Now, this is a really strange one because the Russian church in New York was an embassy chapel, and it was not connected to the diocese in Alaska. It was actually directly under the Metropolitan of St. Petersburg. And the priest of that church in New York, that chapel, was a convert to Orthodoxy. He was Dutch. He had converted to Orthodoxy in 1870 from Roman Catholicism. And he ran that embassy chapel for about 13 years before they closed the chapel, and then he ended up leaving the Orthodox Church. So when we get to 1890, there are two Orthodox churches in what we would now call the lower 48 states. There's one in San Francisco, there's one in New Orleans, and that's it in 1890. In 1890, the Russian bishop in San Francisco was a man named Vladimir, and he was a very controversial figure. And during his short period in America, 1888 to 1891, he was the church was burned to the ground. It was alleged that it was arson that had caused this, and some people blamed Bishop Vladimir, claiming that he was trying to cover up a financial scandal. There was a financial scandal in the community. There were also more dark allegations of abuse, which I don't really want to get into because they're pretty graphic, against the bishop, right? So he was in, and the parish was in a state of almost like a civil war in that community. Incidentally, a young man who was in that parish, who grew up in that San Francisco parish, was the future Saint Sebastian Dabovic. So that was his home parish, this church in San Francisco. So in 1890, we have an embattled Russian bishop in San Francisco. There's a Greek outpost in New Orleans, and that's all we've basically got. And then right at this moment in history, two big events happen simultaneously. And the first, that I'll talk about is what we sort of call in Orthodox circles sometimes the return of the Unia. So there were, as many of you may know, there were Orthodox Christians in the 16th and 17th centuries in what would later become the Austro-Hungarian Empire, places like Poland, Lithuania, what are now modern Ukraine, the Carpathian Mountain region, that were Orthodox people who embraced the Roman Catholic Pope. They retained the externals of Orthodoxy, but they were under Rome. They had left the Orthodox Church and were under Rome. And we commonly will hear about these referred to now as the Uniates, because they had entered into a series of unions with the Roman Catholics. The Uniates started coming to America in the late 1800s, and when they got to America, there was a fully established Roman Catholic structure in the United States, and many of these Roman Catholics were not leadership, the bishops of the Roman Catholic Church, were not pleased at all that there were these Eastern Rite, Uniates showing up and trying to start their own churches. And so one of this all came to a head in 1889 when a widower priest, a Uniate priest named Alexis Toth, came to Minneapolis, Minnesota to set up a church, to take over a Uniate church. And he went, as was per protocol, he went to the Roman Catholic Archbishop, the local Archbishop, John Ireland of Minneapolis, and he presented his credentials. And the way he describes it later, he and the Roman Catholic Archbishop had a massive conflict. The Archbishop blew up at him. Why? I don't want your kind here. Your people don't need, they can go to the Polish church. They don't need you. Get out of my diocese. And Saint Alexis, he would go on to be Saint Alexis. He said just as many harsh things to the Roman Catholic bishop. And then he left. He stormed out of the meeting, and he said later that was the moment when he decided to do what had been in his heart for a long time, which was to become an Orthodox Christian. Now, this was easier said than done in 1889, because in 1889, like I said, you had two Orthodox churches, neither of them anywhere close to Minneapolis, Minnesota. So he had to do a bit of investigating. And eventually he figured out that there was a Russian bishop out on the West Coast. He sent a delegation from his parish out to meet that bishop, Bishop Vladimir. And this led to, after a couple of years, St. Alexis and his entire community in Minneapolis being received into the Orthodox Church by Bishop Vladimir. So this was the beginning of what's been called the return of the Unia, which would totally transform the Russian mission in America, a mission that was originally directed towards natives in Alaska. In the period we're going to talk about, the mission really has shifted to be almost entirely about the return of the Unia, bringing these Uniates into the Orthodox Church. And this was all really led by St. Alexis. So that was happening at the beginning of the 1890s. And basically the same moment, the United States Congress changed its immigration laws, which made it much easier for people to immigrate to the United States from places like the Eastern Mediterranean and Eastern Europe. And so what we see then beginning in the 1890s is we see the opening of Ellis Island as an immigration station, and then a flood of hundreds of thousands of Orthodox Christians flooding into the East Coast of the United States over a period of about 25 years. When these people came, they were coming from the Ottoman Empire, they were coming from Eastern Europe, lots of Greeks, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Greeks, Serbs, Antiochians, Syrians, Lebanese, and others. There were Romanians, there were Bulgarians, there were Albanians, right? There were thousands of these people arriving. This is when my family came to America. They arrived on the East Coast, and there was no Orthodoxy to speak of. There were no churches. There was no church structure. The Russian bishop Vladimir was on the West Coast, but nobody knew who he was. And so when these people arrive in New York or Baltimore or Boston or someplace like that, they don't have any kind of organized church structure to take care of them. And so they started establishing their own churches, these immigrants. And originally, these people the typical model that we would see is that you would have a community of Orthodox immigrants of different ethnic backgrounds. And these people would typically, they would band together because there were so few of them. They would all kind of band together as Orthodox in a particular city. And they would go to, sort of say, well, let's form a mutual aid society. Let's try to get a priest over here. they would start maybe a chapel or a church. And when the community would reach kind of a critical mass of one ethnicity, then that the sort of classic model would be that ethnic group would split off and start their own ethnic church. So an example of this would be in Seattle, which is obviously the opposite coast, but in Seattle, a few years after what we're talking about, there was a church established under the Russian church called Saint Spiridon, who of course is a Greek saint. And that was because the biggest funders of that church were Greek. And so they established Saint Spiridon's in Seattle. And after a few years, the Greek community in that parish had grown to such a size that it could support have its own church. And so everybody thought it was just perfectly natural. Well, yeah, of course, the Greeks will go and set up their own church down the road. And the Russians and the Serbs in that community, celebrated the fact that their Greek brothers could have a church of their own, so this was not seen as necessarily a conflict. In Chicago, we had a sort of similar model. In Chicago, the first church that was established, they tried to establish a pan-Orthodox, a sort of multi-ethnic community in Chicago in the late 1880s, so right before the Great Immigration. But because of various factors, it just never came together. And so what they did in Chicago was they established a Greek church first. The Greeks got their church. And then very shortly after that, a Russian church was established. And so that Chicago was the first place where we have what you might call overlapping jurisdictions, which is the norm today, right? But Chicago was the first place that happened. And yet the communities got along great. There was not, they would concelebrate, a clergy would concelebrate together. If the Russian bishop visited Chicago, the Greek priest would come over for the hierarchical liturgy. They, when the Tsar died, the memorial, Tsar Alexander III died, they held the memorial service at the Greek church. So it was there was a lot of give and take. It wasn't a sort of any conflict in these communities at this early point, but they sort of still had this idea of being separate and ethnically distinct. Now, in 1892, Bishop Vladimir is recalled to Russia amidst just unending scandal and controversy. And he's replaced by a remarkable man, Bishop Nicholas Zyrov. Bishop Nicholas is, I think, I would say he's one of the most underrated figures in American Orthodox history, because Bishop Nicholas is a real visionary, but of course he was succeeded by an even greater visionary, Saint Tikhon. So it's easy to, Saint Tikhon is so great and such a remarkable man that it's easy to lose sight of the fact that Bishop Nicholas was while not Saint Tikhon, Bishop Nicholas was also a very good leader and a very important figure. So Bishop Nicholas comes to America right at the beginning of this immigration. There are these churches just beginning to pop up, these multi-ethnic churches, and there's this beginning of this Uniate conversion to Orthodoxy. So he's confronted with a very unique situation, maybe unique for a bishop in the history of the church, to have a continent-sized diocese, basically, and this kind of complexity. And so Bishop Nicholas's response to this is very interesting. He does two things that I think are foundational for what was to come for Saint Tikhon. What Bishop Nicholas does is, first of all, he recruits he goes and recruits clergy to come to America. So he recruited a very young St. Alexander Hodovitsky straight out of seminary in Russia. He recruited St. John Kochorov, who was St. Alexander's best friend in seminary, straight out of seminary to come to America. He puts St. Alexander in New York, and he puts St. John Kochorov in Chicago. These are two of the major sort of early centers for Orthodoxy in America. so Bishop Nicholas did an excellent job of finding young, talented people and bringing them to America. But he also seems to have been the person who came up with this idea of what some have referred to as ethnic client clergy, is the term that Father John Erickson has used. The idea of clergy of other ethnicities, not Russian, to serve in the Russian mission in America, but to take care of their particular ethnic groups. So it is Bishop Nicholas brings over on the same voyage, he brings to America St. Raphael Hallowini to take care of the Syrians. And then he also brings over a remarkable elderly at the time priest, Father Theoklitos Triantafilides, to serve in a parish in Galveston, Texas. Now, Galveston, Texas now is sort of practically like a suburb of Houston, right? But Galveston was the big city before there was a hurricane in the early 1900s. Before that hurricane wrecked Galveston, it was Galveston that was the dominant city, not Houston. Galveston was a major port city, and there were a lot of Orthodox people in Galveston. And the Galveston community was very diverse, lots of different Orthodox ethnic groups. And they wanted a priest. They decided to go not the New Orleans sort of path of petitioning the Church of Greece. They petitioned the Russians for some help. And the Tsar himself, Tsar Nicholas II, sends his own tutor from his childhood, a Greek priest, Father Theoklitos, to America. So Father Theoklitos had been a monk on Mount Athos. He had been the tutor to the King of Greece, the future King of Greece. He had then become the tutor to the future Tsar Nicholas II. And he was one of the priests who served at the wedding of Nicholas and Alexandra. And so he was about 60 years old, which was for that day and age fairly old at the time. But Tsar Nicholas, St. Nicholas, sent him to Galveston, Texas, to take care of this church. And he ended up spending about 20 years or so in Galveston, Father Theoklitos. He was Greek, but he had a very multi-ethnic community. And he was one of these priests who didn't just have his parish. A lot of priests, they didn't just have their parish. They had responsibility for a bigger piece of territory. And he was one of these priests that are sometimes referred to as circuit riders, who would travel around sometimes on horseback or horse and buggy, or on trains. They would travel around to different cities and towns, seeking out, finding Orthodox people, doing baptisms and weddings and funerals and so forth. Father Theoklitos was responsible for the area in the Gulf Coast of the United States. There were lots of examples of this. Even St. Alexander Hodovitsky and St. John Kochorov, who we think of as New York and Chicago, they actually had a lot bigger area that they covered and would travel around and serve. So we have another important figure that I need to mention is Saint Sebastian Dabovic. Now, Saint Sebastian was not brought to America. He was from America. He was American born. His parents were immigrants from Serbia to San Francisco. He was born right before the San Francisco church was started. So his family were founding members of the San Francisco church. And so Saint Sebastian was a native born American. And he was educated in Russia, and Bishop Nicholas quickly saw that Saint Sebastian was an unusually gifted clergyman, and he ordained him to the priesthood. He was a deacon at the time. He ordained him to the priesthood, and he put Saint Sebastian in charge of caring for the Serbs in America. So Saint Sebastian, the situation with the Serbs was complex, because the Saint Sebastian was always, I think, my impression of him, he was seen as this figure. He was trying to be this bridge between the Russians and the Serbs. He'd grown up in a Russian cathedral. He was American born, but he was Serbian, you know, and he was very patriotic about being Serbian. But he was there were some of the clergy that came and the people that came to America, the Serbian Orthodox, that viewed him with a little bit of suspicion, like he wasn't exactly a real Serb because he wasn't from there, and he was really friendly with these Russians, and he was really an American, and so he was a great leader, but he was always sort of hamstrung, I think, by people having this suspicion about him, which is unfortunate. And the Serbs, they were under the Russian diocese, sort of technically, but it was complicated because the Serbs were, when they wanted a priest, it was not typical for them to go to the Russian bishop and say, please assign a priest to us, right? What the Serbs would do is they would, more commonly, try to recruit a priest on their own. They would maybe send the parish council president back to the old country to find a priest. There's one example where a Serbian church, there was a Serbian newspaper in America, and the Serbian church put an ad in the newspaper trying to poach a priest from another Serbian church in America, trying to see if anybody wanted a new job. You know, so the Serbs actually voted in 1913 to formally cut ties with the Russian church. But that didn't actually happen until after World War I. It didn't sort of like officially happen, but they had kind of one foot out the door for a long time in this period, despite the efforts of Saint Sebastian to kind of hold things together. Saint Raphael was himself a remarkable figure. Saint Raphael, brought to America by Bishop Nicholas Zyrov, and he was the unquestioned leader of his people. We don't, you know, unlike the situation with the Serbs, where they would sort of go find their own priest, hire them themselves in their parishes. In the Syrian churches, the Antiochian churches, they were originally very clearly under the Russian diocese. This would become less clear over time. But Saint Raphael was the leader. You know, he would decide who was the priest in a parish, but he liked to let the local community have a role in that decision. And so, as was very common in Syria at the time, and in other parts of the Orthodox world, the local community would nominate one of their own in some cases, and Saint Raphael would simply confirm the nomination. So the example of this is in Kearney, Nebraska. They wanted a priest, and he said, well, I'll give you a priest if you can pay him. I'll make sure he's ordained, but you're going to have to supply me with the man. You know, find someone in your community. And so they ended up nominating the Nicola Yeni, who became Father Nicola Yeni, who I could talk for hours about, but I won't, who may well himself be a saint. And Saint Raphael then ordained him to the priesthood. So there was more cohesion among the Syrians than there was among the Serbs. With the Syrians, there was ambiguity about who exactly are we under. When they came to America, it was clear that they were under the Russian church at the very beginning. Saint Raphael was pretty clearly under the Russian church. But by the time we get about 10 years in, about 1905, Saint Raphael is openly saying things like, we are a diocese of Antioch, notwithstanding our nominal allegiance to the Russian Holy Synod. There are these ambiguous statements, and the people themselves pretty clearly were not clear on who exactly they were under, as events that we'll be talking about in a second will make more clear. So the Syrians and the Serbs are the two largest non-Russian ethnic groups that were connected with the Russian diocese. The Russian diocese itself was growing largely because of Uniate conversions to Orthodoxy. The Uniates, in some cases, these former Uniates, the priests would come up through those communities, but in other cases, you had priests brought in from Russia, and model would be that a priest would come in and do kind of a tour of duty in America, maybe spend 5 or 6 years and then move on. So the connection between priest and community in the Russian church was probably, it seems like it was less sort of strong than it was in who were having a role in selecting. In 1898 was the leadership was taken over by, promoted to a new position. He ended up becoming ultimately the Archbishop of Warsaw, and Saint Tikhon, who was a very young bishop, came to America. Now Saint Tikhon was a real visionary. He came to America. He saw the foundation laid by Bishop Nicholas. When Bishop Nicholas arrived, there was virtually nothing. When he left, there was a growing diocese, a rapidly growing diocese. So St. Tikhon came, and he totally embraced the idea of these different ethnic clergy taking care of their people. And he expanded on that idea, and he ultimately proposed to the Russian Holy Synod a new model for the diocese. He proposed that the diocese have ethnic vicariates within it, and that each of these ethnic vicariates, a Syrian vicariate, a Serbian vicariate, and so forth, would be led by an ethnic Syrian, an ethnic Serb, etc., but that they would all be bishops, he envisioned, and that they would all be under the Russian Holy Synod. They would all ultimately look to the Russian Archbishop for leadership, but they would be basically independent in their own sphere. What he's proposing is overlapping ethnic jurisdictions, tied together by a common local synod and a common primate locally, but still he's proposing, overlapping ethnic jurisdictions. And so St. Tikhon, he began to implement this vision by ordaining consecrating St. Raphael to the episcopacy. He wanted to make St. Sebastian Dabovic a bishop, but for various reasons that just never happened. Then there was the more complex problem of the Greeks. Now, the Greeks in America, unlike the Syrians and the Serbs, really didn't have a relationship with the Russians. There was the example I gave of Father Theoklitos Triantafilides, but he was the exception. The general rule was that a Greek church in America was independent for all intents and purposes of any real authority. The local parish board of directors, the parish council, had virtually total control over the parish. They would hire and fire the priest. They controlled all the parish properties. They would decide, who were members, and membership would be based on paying the dues and so forth. Other Orthodox churches in this time also used a similar model, but the Greeks were most independent of the hierarchy. You had Greek churches would typically, they would look to old world hierarchs to supply them with clergy. So you would have the Archbishop of Athens, often would be looked to, sometimes the Ecumenical Patriarchate, sometimes it would be just a local bishop from the local town where the people are from. It was sort of all over the place. Within the Greek churches, you started to see divisions, intra-Greek divisions emerging. So early on, you might have, like in New York or in Chicago, multiple Greek parishes started because you had Greeks from different parts of the Greek-speaking world who, yes, they all spoke Greek, but they were very culturally very, not the same, right? And so they would start their own churches, and those churches might be under different bishops. So this was the case in New York, for example, in the 1890s. There were were they part of the Russian mission? The short answer is no. They Saint Tikhon wrote back to his Holy Synod in a report. He said that they I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically said they should be under under me. It would do them well to be under me, but they're not. And it was a problem. It was a very much like a kind of a Wild West situation for the Greek communities. They were, by the time we get to the mid-teens, 50% of the Orthodox Christians in the United States were Greek, right? But they weren't part of the Russian mission at all. They weren't connected to the Russian mission. And because there was no real hierarchical oversight, priests were hired and fired just willy-nilly. Communities would get into legal disputes. That this was more common at the early stage with the Greek communities. It became common among everyone when we get into the 20s, but that's beyond what we're talking about. In 1908, it became clear that there was a problem in America of oversight of the Greek clergy. There was a pattern emerging that was starting to come to the attention of the United States government, that there were Greek clergy in America who were not actually clergy. You might have a rogue monk who decided to come to America because and start acting like he was a priest, or someone who was disciplined in Greece or in Turkey who was coming to America to try to escape whatever it was that was going on over there. And then they would come over here and they would do weddings, for example. And this became an issue for the United States government because they said, okay, look, we've got these young Greek men marrying American women, but these weddings are not recognized by the church in Greece or overseas by the Greek Orthodox Church, because these people aren't real clergymen. And so these American brides don't have don't have any rights with respect to their marriage. This was a real, it became not a major, but a very minor international incident. There are State Department documents and correspondence about this. So this problem of unauthorized rogue Greek clergy or pseudo clergy roaming around the United States, this problem combined with another issue, which was that you had a lot of Greeks in America who were very anti-Ottoman, very openly anti-Ottoman. They would openly criticize the Turkish government. And the Ecumenical Patriarchate, there were these twin problems of administration, right? And so what the Ecumenical Patriarchate decided to do to address this problem was to issue a tomos in 1908. They issued a tomos. Ostensibly, they transferred the Greek churches in the so-called diaspora from the Ecumenical Patriarchate to the Church of Greece. That's what the tomos purported to do. In fact, very few communities were transferred, right? Because but the effect of this was for Constantinople to disavow or give up responsibility for these very, I think, a reasonable pastoral decision. It was also the idea of the so-called kind of barbarian lands, the idea that Constantinople has some kind of extraterritorial jurisdiction in lands that are not under a particular autocephalous church. That concept was not fully formed in 1908, but that 1908 tomos was actually the first time with anything resembling that was ever. So the Constantinople, when they issued this homo then is that you had a lot of Greek government officials in America, and the ambassador, various Greek consuls, who had a lot of power in the Greek American community, and they weren't too keen on the idea of a bishop coming over and becoming this kind of new center of power that would take away from their influence. So in part because of that, for 10 years, the Church of Greece did not send anyone to America. And so the situation in America among the Greek communities remained chaotic. It became even more chaotic because of politics in Greece. There were factions in Greece that supported the king of Greece, King Constantine. There were factions that supported the prime minister, Eleftheros Venizelos. And these two factions were mapped over onto the Greek American community. So you had Greek Americans that were Venizelists or Royalists, and they would start establishing their own churches, a Venizelist church here, a Royalist church there. So teens. Another thing I should mention here is that most of the Orthodox in America in this period were men. The percentages varied based on the ethnic group. The Syrians had a pretty even balance of men and women, but when you look at the Greeks, the Serbs, the Carpatho-Russians that formed the core of the Russian mission, they were overwhelmingly male in this early period. Well over 80%, for example, of the Greek Orthodox in America were men. So I think this is an important thing to be mindful of. Like we're not talking about communities that necessarily look like what we think of today, right? Because the demographics were just totally different. There were fewer children, and we also had a lot of back and forth of immigrants. It wasn't just a one-way immigration, right? You had people coming to America. They would work. These immigrants would work here for a while, and then they'd go back home. It wasn't like everybody was coming here and staying here. So I think that's also important to be mindful of. And that's part of the reason why you see old world politics really influencing the Orthodox communities over here, because there is this back and forth that's happening. Another theme that was common in this period was the relationship between the Orthodox and the Episcopalians. The photo that Deacon Andre used on the Facebook, scheduling thing for this discussion was a photo of Saint Tikhon and Saint John Kochorov and Saint Sebastian Dabovic at the consecration of an Episcopalian bishop in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. And the thing that's striking is Saint Tikhon is fully vested, right? He's not just there. I mean, he's there as an observer. He didn't participate, but he's fully vested. This was at the very beginning of Saint Tikhon's time in America, and the relationship between the Episcopalians and the Orthodox was at its height, really. It had really started to get elevated in the 1860s during the time of Saint Philaret of Moscow, when the Anglicans started to reach out. The Episcopalians started to reach out to the Orthodox and try to have a sort of an ecumenical dialogue. That was something that Saint Tikhon really embraced. Saint Tikhon was very close friends with the Episcopalian bishop of Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, who was one of the leading bishops in the Episcopal Church, Charles Grafton, and they shared this hope that the Orthodox and the Episcopalians could someday perhaps be united in their lifetimes. They thought that this was really imminent, and there were active dialogues taking place. A couple of things threw a wrench in that one of those was that Saint Tikhon in 1905 made the decision to receive into Orthodoxy and subsequently ordained to the priesthood a defrocked Episcopalian priest named Ingram Irvine. Saint Tikhon, this was like an earthquake in the Episcopal Orthodox relationship. The Episcopalians were they said, well, hold on, you're you're on our canonical territory. You can't take one of our clergy and ordain him. That doesn't, that's not allowed. And St. Tikhon said, well, hold on a second. We're not actually in communion with you. This is, we're not the same church. I don't have the ability, and he expressed this, whatever I might feel personally, I don't have the authority to unilaterally declare that we're one church. And so that really threw a wrench in the relationship between the Episcopalians and the Orthodox. Another thing that happened a couple years later, they established this official, formal kind of standing committee for dialogue. And St. Raphael was the head of the Orthodox delegation to this dialogue. And shortly after this, St. Raphael said, listen, I've got a lot of people all over the country. They not all of them are anywhere near an Orthodox church. So in an emergency, when, in an extreme situation, I will allow an Episcopal priest to do kind of last rites type, give the communion to a dying person, to baptize somebody in an emergency, to do a funeral, some narrow things. He had sort of narrow parameters. When he said this, the Episcopal clergy seized on this and said, hey, look, we've got authorization to go in and take these Orthodox people. And they told the Orthodox people, look, your bishop said this is fine. And so a lot of Syrians started going to the Episcopal Church. And St. Raphael, to his great credit, and it reveals something about St. Raphael's character. He realized that he had done something wrong. He realized he had made a major mistake. And so instead of just trying to sort of walk it back slowly, save face, right, as he might have, many of us might have been tempted to do, he owned the mistake. He wrote a letter, a pastoral letter, and said, I said this before, I was wrong. I was completely wrong. Stop doing what I said before. Do not go to the Episcopalians for sacraments. This is not okay. And so he made a total 180 in the span of about 18 months. And it reveals something of his character in that the way he handled not just the decision to change course, but the way that he openly owned that he had made a mistake and changed his position on this. So Saint Raphael was one of the only, he was the only Orthodox leader in this period to really embrace the use of English. I mentioned that St. Tikhon had brought this Episcopalian priest into Orthodoxy. St. Raphael, after St. Tikhon left the United States, this priest became a secretary to St. Raphael. And St. Raphael, he also noticed that so the Russian church had helped to publish the translation of the service book into English by Isabel Hapgood. And this was not the first English translation of Orthodox liturgical texts, but it was certainly the best and the most comprehensive and the most widely available. So St. Raphael, he decided to encourage his communities all around the country to use this text, the service book in English. And so it's a striking thing is we have data from 1906, which is right when the service book was published. And the data shows that effectively almost 100% of Orthodox liturgical services in America were in non-English languages. They're in Church Slavonic, they're in Greek, they're in Arabic, right? We flash forward 10 years. Everybody else is continuing to use their traditional languages, except the Antiochians under St. Raphael, who had gone now to majority English in their churches in a period of 10 years. And that was through the encouragement of St. Raphael. St. Raphael also was a big proponent of Sunday schools. He really was concerned about losing the young people. He had more young people than proportionally than the other ethnic groups, because he had more females in his community than most of the ethnic groups. And so he really was mindful of the fact that these young people need to hear the liturgical services in their native language, which is now English. They need to be educated about the Orthodox faith. So he was a big proponent of Sunday school. So that's another example. As you can tell, I'm a big fan of St. Raphael. We're running a little short on time on this session, the period that you asked me to talk. So I'm going to sort of finish things up by talking about the teens. So as we get into the teens, things start changing, and not changing necessarily for the better. St. Tikhon left the United States in 1907. This was pretty normal. He never intended, there was never the intention that he would stay in America. Even St. Tikhon understood that it was, he would be transferred eventually. And so he was transferred. And then of course he goes on, as we know, to become Patriarch of Moscow and a great saint. But it wasn't just him that left. St. John Kochorov left at the same time. Right around this time, St. Alexis Toth died. St. Alexis being the leader of the mission to the Uniates. So there's a real changing the guard that's happening in the late aughts, right? The 1907, 1909 period. The new Russian bishop was Archbishop Platon. And Archbishop Platon was a strong leader, but he lacked the kind of pastoral sensitivity of St. Tikhon. And so, but under Archbishop Platon, it did the return of the Unia continued, but the relationship with the ethnic jurisdiction, the ethnic sort of groups, and the Russian church became more complex and fractured. It was already probably inevitably fracturing more and more, but this happened during this period. It was during the time of Platon that, for example, the Serbs formally asked to leave the Russian mission. In 1914, Platon himself was replaced by Archbishop Evdalkeem. And while Platon was a strong leader, Evdalkeem was a very weak man, and lacked any real leadership skills. Coincident with that, St. Alexander Hodovitsky left America. So around 1914, so we're seeing this, the saints are leaving the scene. St. Sebastian Dabovic, his influence is waning. Under St. Tikhon, St. Sebastian was seen as a rising star. St. Tikhon recognized that St. Sebastian was a great man. And I don't know what Archbishop Platon thought of St. Sebastian exactly, but St. Sebastian's influence in the American church scene started to decline. He ended up during World War I going over to Serbia to assist in the war effort, to serve as a chaplain. And while he came back to America at various points, he ultimately spent the later years of his life, the later decades of his life, in Serbia. And so although he was born in America, he actually died in Serbia. So he sort of leaves the scene at about the same time. And then in 1915, February of 1915, St. Raphael himself dies. He basically worked himself to death. I mean, he died in his 50s. He was not an elderly man at all, but he worked himself so hard, and he ultimately died. And when he died, his clergy were at the funeral. They were not at all clear on who are we under, actually. And at the funeral, a division emerges between the Rusi faction that wants to be under the Russian church and the Antiochi faction that wants to be under the Patriarchate of Antioch. Conveniently or inconveniently, depending on your perspective, there was an Antiochian metropolitan who was visiting America at the time to raise money, named Germanos Shahadi. And that Antiochian metropolitan saw this as a golden opportunity to try to, plant a flag in America. Not so much for Antioch as for himself. He didn't have the blessing of Antioch, but he decided to start an American Antiochian jurisdiction. And that was the beginning of the splintering of the Antiochians. the Greeks had already been quite splintered, and in 1918, the Archbishop of Athens himself, who named Meletios Metaxakis, who was probably one of the most consequential figures in Orthodoxy in the 20th century, came to America and started to organize the Greek Archdiocese of America. Some people in more recent times have tried to present the formation of the Greek Archdiocese as the beginning of the kind of unjust breakup of the unified Russian mission to America, and that's completely wrong-headed. The Greek Archdiocese, whatever you think of Metaxakis, the formation of the Greek Archdiocese was a step towards unity rather than a step back from it. It was because what at least they were trying to do was take these scattered Greek churches and sort of stitch them together into a single jurisdiction, rather than having a bunch of independent parishes. So I think the concept, at least, is pretty clearly a movement towards something more organized and unified, as opposed to away from it. And I should add that Metaxakis, when he arrived, was welcomed with open arms by the Russian leadership in America. He wasn't seen as this kind of invader or anything like that. Of course, the other big thing that happened in this period was 1917. And the revolutions in Russia, which ultimately led to the loss of funding for the Russian Church in America, was funded by largely it was funded by the Tsarist government, and that subsidy vanishes after the revolutions, and it throws the American church the Russian Church in America into total disarray. The bishop who was sort of left in charge, Alexander Nemolovsky, under him, he starts having the parishes get mortgages on their properties to help pay the bills, which obviously, like, you're just charging the credit card, right, to pay your rent. That's not going to cut it for long. So it created a real crisis. Not only a crisis financially, of course, there was a crisis of leadership in the Russian Church in America. What we end up seeing as we go forward is that there were Russian sort of non-canonical Russian people claiming to be bishops coming to America, associated with the Living Church, backed by the Soviet government, trying to take control of the church properties in America. It leads to decades of legal battles and conflict and chaos. So the Russian church was thrown into just turmoil at this point in 1917, after 1917. So I wouldn't say that this early period that we've been talking about was in any way kind of a golden age. It wasn't idyllic. It had a lot of problems and challenges. It did have a number of saints, and it did have some great things about it. And while the Greek situation becomes more unified after this period than it was during this period that we're talking about, for everyone else, it was chaos, and then more chaos, and then more chaos as time goes on. And so by the time we get to the 1920s, we have many of the Orthodox ethnic groups, even some of the smaller ones, they have multiple competing ethnic jurisdictions. We have multiple Greek jurisdictions. We have multiple Russian jurisdictions. Eventually, the Russian Orthodox Church abroad, the Russian Church outside of Russia, comes onto the scene, right? As we move further into the 20s. Multiple Antiochian jurisdictions. At one point, there are 5 bishops competing to be the leader of the Antiochians in the early 1930s. And this kind of jurisdictional chaos becomes the hallmark of the period after this time that we've just talked about. So that is what I have to say about the 1890 to 1917 period. It ends on a little bit of like a downer note, right? And yet we're all here, and it is this period in which Orthodoxy was established, and I think but for this period of time, but for the efforts of these immigrants that were, I think that the thing that's really striking about this period to me is how much the immigrants and the lay people themselves really drove things. I mean, you had great leaders like Bishop Nicholas and St. Tikhon and St. Raphael, but they were coming and they were cooperating with ordinary people who were putting their money just spending their money to build churches, and who were making the effort to acquire clergy and doing what they could to establish orthodoxy here. And that's one of the things I like to point out is, you know, these were not the people that brought orthodoxy to America in this period were not missionaries, and they were not great leaders and visionaries. The great leaders came to serve those people, right? St. Tikhon came here to serve people, and he did an amazing job, but he came to serve people who had already established these churches and were establishing them, right? And these people they weren't theologians, and they weren't thinking things through in the way that we might be able to look back and think them through. But I think we also do still owe a sort of debt of gratitude to those people for sort of laying the foundations of orthodoxy in America, because had they not done that, then my ancestors and many others would not have established. They wouldn't have been Orthodox. They would have probably just become Episcopalians, you know, or something like that. So I think that this period is chaotic, but also extremely foundational and formative for the future of Orthodoxy in America that would come for the next 100 years.
Thank you. Thank you, Matthew. Exceeded all my expectations. It was super dynamic. So kind of going like 80 miles in the sense of information, but I mean, everything was very clear. So we already have the first question from our seminarians, and we'll let seminarians, if they're still with us, to ask questions first. And the first one goes, my question is, how did Russian Orthodox Church receive this Unia converts? Was it done simply through the confession of faith, or were those Christian congregations rebaptized?
My understanding is they were received through confession of faith.
Right. Yes, that was standard practice at this time, and still. Thank you. More questions? Yeah, there is a new one. Right. So there is just, thank you. Okay. Any more questions from the students? I'm actually not seeing more questions from the students. So the floor is open, and please send your questions via chat, unless you want to unmute your microphone and speak. That's also an option.
And while you're doing that, do you have the ability to share your screen? For me to share my screen?
Yeah, yes. If you have to share something like a presentation,
it says that you've disabled screen sharing. If you could enable it.
All right.
There's a few photos that I thought I could share.
Sure. I didn't do it on purpose. I'm not right. You should be able to share your screen. I'm not seeing why you should not.
No, it says host disabled participant screen sharing.
That's odd. Right. In the meantime, there is a question. Let me figure it out.
Yeah. So the question I'm seeing here is, has there ever been another situation in church history where the faith was primarily established in new lands through the migration of lay people rather than missionaries? It's a great question. Yes, there has, but not probably at this scale. I mean, Orthodoxy was established in China, for example, initially by the immigration of, my understanding is it was established by the immigration of Orthodox people into China. Ultimately, there may be missionary work happening, but it wasn't sort of like a virgin mission field. Even Alaska, to be honest, I mean, Alaska began with lay people, Russian fur traders and trappers coming to North America, and then sharing their faith, and then eventually, and this was decades prior to the beginning of the actual mission, to the Kodiak mission, right? Like the Kodiak mission wasn't going somewhere that had no interaction with Orthodoxy. They arrived and there were people that had been even baptized by laymen, you know? So even that was begun, I think, in a way by lay people. I just got a private message from my friend, Father Andrew Dabovic, saying Orthodoxy in Britain was established by lay immigration. Much of the early spread in the Roman Empire was via immigration of both Jews and Christians. I would add also, you know, there are examples in more modern times of, you know, if you think about like Africa, South Africa, now, you know, sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of that is, there's this sort of a more complex, different story, but South Africa was Greek immigrants to South Africa, right? And then the church responds by taking, you know, sending clergy to take care of those people. So there are other examples like that. Yeah, I think America is unusual in the sense that, like, the lower 48 is not mission in the same way we commonly think of mission, right? Even you had the Unia, but even that's a complicated story, right? Because they're not unbaptized pagans, right? They're Unians, so it's complicated.
You should Matthew, you should be able to share the screen right now if you wish.
Okay, I'm going to answer a couple other questions.
Okay,
that I just noticed come in. One was, what role did Archimandrite Efthymios influence the clergy at the funeral of Bishop Raphael? So at St. Raphael's funeral, there were factions that emerged over who should be the bishop. And one of those factions sort of coalesced around Efthymios Ophaish, who was a highly ambitious young clergyman, you know, an archimandrite, so he's canonically eligible to be ordained, can be consecrated. And Efthymios, I mean, I don't know that he influenced there being a division. I think he was one of the points around which that division coalesced. I don't know if that is clear. Although I'm not familiar. I don't think anybody knows for sure the exact conversations that happened at that funeral. We know the division occurred at the funeral, but you know, I don't have the details on whether he was. I'm sure he was very vocal, because he was just a vocal person. He was very, like, politically ambitious. He was very personally ambitious. He wanted power. He thought he knew better than other people about how to run things. So it wouldn't shock me if he was one of the main people standing up and sort of pushing people. I see how many Greek parishes were under the Russian church. So, and then the question is, did St. Nicholas Church in Manhattan that was destroyed at 9/11, was that under the Russian church? My understanding is that it was not. I don't know about the St. Nicholas that was destroyed at 9/11 having gifts. I didn't know about there being gifts from the Russian Tsar.
No. It was a privately ran Greek corporation, and on those grounds, they refused the entry to Bishop Tikhon, because Bishop Tikhon wanted to visit this church, and he was denied access because it was mentioned that it was a private American establishment.
Right, I believe that was Holy Trinity, though, in
Really?
New York that
I
you're
thought
referring to.
Nicholas that was destroyed by collapsed twins.
Yeah, I think that was established later. I think that St. Nicholas was established later.
Okay.
But very few. I don't know the exact number. I have it in. I could look it up. But you're talking about a small handful of Greek parishes that requested antimencia from the Russian church. I will say that when the Russian church, they would publish an official list of parishes that were under the Russian archdiocese, and no Greek parishes ever appear on those lists. So, you know, that having said that, there were Greek priests serving multi-ethnic communities. So like in Seattle, eventually there's a Greek priest named Father Michael Andriades serving in Seattle, which is called St. Spiridon's. So, you know, it's not to say that there wasn't any Greek connectivity to the Russian church. St. Tikhon would occasionally send back to the Holy Synod in Russia. He would send like reports of the demographics of his communities. And there were a few hundred Greeks, as I recall from those reports, compared to, you know, tens or hundreds of thousands of Greeks in the United States. So it's an infinitesimally small percentage. What role do the embassies, if there were any, of the Orthodox nations play on the history of Orthodoxy in America back then? Embassies and consulates played an important role. Probably the best example is the Greek situation that I mentioned, where you had Greek ambassadors and consuls that were not necessarily wanting to have a bishop come over, because it would sort of take away from their influence over the Greek American communities, where they were viewed as kind of the leaders of the community. There were interactions when I mentioned the 1908 situation with the Greek clergy, and how the Greek clergy were, there were these rogue clergy coming over with lack of credentials, etc. That was where the U.S. State Department engages with the embassy, the Greek embassy and the Turkish embassy, to try to address this problem. So these things happened, but they weren't, in the Russian side, they were less directly involved in, like, say, setting up churches than they were in the Greek context. Today in the United States, the churches of the Russian tradition and the Greek Orthodox tradition in Orthodox missionary work are of great interest. In general, the American church is in between Constantinople and has no communion with Moscow. I'm not sure what's exactly, no communication. I'm not sure what's exactly being asked here. But they're asking, is it possible to create a single autocephalous Orthodox church in America? I mean, that's an opinion question, right? I think that's a long shot in my lifetime, at least. But you know, history moves quickly these days. There's a question about how it was mostly immigrants coming from I mentioned it was mostly immigrants coming from the old country that would establish parishes in America. And the question was about Canada. Did this happen with Canada? So in Canada, this isn't really my focus of my own work, but Canada, there was a connectivity between the Canadian and the American, the United States sort of Orthodox situations. There were immigrants, there were Uniats, there was mission work there were missionaries from the United States side that were like Russian clergy, for example, that would go into Canada and spend time in Canada and establish churches in Canada. Canada has its own sort of interesting, unique stories. But there was eventually there were Russian hierarchy that were assigned bishops to Canada. So yeah, Canada was part of the Russian diocese. It was the archdiocese of the Aleutian Islands in North America eventually. So Canada was part of that. And in when you talk about like the Antiochians, St. Raphael had parishes in like Montreal. You had Greek immigrant communities in these cities, Toronto being probably the most obvious one. So yeah, I think similar dynamics. Immigration rules were different for Canada. It was sometimes easier for people to get into Canada than in the United States for different reasons. But I think the dynamics were kind of similar. Email me if you want me to send you some stuff on that. The question asked, do we find an outreach to non-Orthodox, non-ethnic Americans at this time? Do I have the impression that the view was that Americans were more the realm of other communities like the Episcopalians? So for the most part, there wasn't missionary work happening among, say, like Protestants, Orthodox trying to convert Protestants to Orthodoxy. Having said that, we know that Father Theoklitos Triantafilides, the Greek priest in Galveston, Texas, who had been the tutor to Tsar Nicholas II and was serving under the Russian mission, we know that he actively evangelized Americans, and he may have been the first to do that. before him, going back to 1867, Saint Innocent, who had been the bishop, obviously in Alaska, right, the enlightener of Alaska, he was elected Metropolitan of Moscow, and he was elected right at the same time that news comes out about the sale of Alaska to the United States. So Saint Innocent, what's that? Oh, sorry. So Saint Innocent is asked, are you upset that Alaska has been sold, that we sold Alaska, your beloved Alaska? And so Saint Innocent's response to the Oberprocurator of the Holy Synod is essentially, no, I'm actually really happy that this happened, because this is our entry point into America proper, and we can make America Orthodox. And here's how we can do it. And he lists like bullet points. Do this, 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 right? And so one of the things like he says, move the headquarters to San Francisco, which they did. He says, send English speaking, switch over to English, use English, send English speaking clergy to America, and translate everything into English and start evangelizing the Americans, is basically St. Innocent's message, right? And they didn't do most of what he said, but St. Innocent saw it. Like St. Innocent got it. It's just that not everybody else was on the same page. You did see, so Father Ingram Irvine converted to Orthodoxy kind of on his own initiative. He, in 1905, he was encouraged in this by St. Sebastian Dabovic, who was like a friend of his. So that's another example of like, there are these individual examples. There's an interesting example of, and I don't know the whole story, I don't think anyone does, of in the early, like late 1890s, early 1900s, St. Alexander Hodovitsky baptizing a Jewish person into and bringing them into the Orthodox Church. So there are these isolated examples. There's an example of a Civil War veteran who in California who studies Orthodoxy, American Civil War veteran, who's elderly at this point. He studies Orthodoxy on his own, decides he wants to become Orthodox, travels to San Francisco to meet St. Tikhon. So these are isolated incidents, but there's not this kind of wholesale approach to evangelism. Question was asked, is it worth looking at how the Roman Catholics managed to streamline their diaspora communities as a model for American Orthodoxy? Catholic apologists will point to the jurisdictional crisis in America as a point against Orthodoxy. However, there were similar ethnic conflicts between Catholics, one of which led to the mass conversion of Unians through St. Alexis Toth. Yeah, there are things we can learn, I think, to some extent. I mean, certainly you had originally in the Roman Catholic world, you had in America, you had different ethnic groups, right? You had the Poles, you had the Germans, you had these different ethnic groups, and they would have their own ethnic communities, and that's mostly gone away. The complexity with the Uniates is a little different because they were Eastern Rite. So the Rite was part of the problem from the Roman Catholic perspective. I think the challenge a little bit, like one of the challenges we face in America, honestly, is there were continuous waves of immigration, right? So you had the big immigration stops in the early 20s when the US imposes immigration quotas. And at that point, everybody's sort of like, we're all here. There's this movement by a lot of the Orthodox in America to kind of Americanize. But then we start seeing waves of immigration, and they're just kind of not at random, but kind of unpredictably, right? So you have Russian immigrants coming over, fleeing the revolution. You have in the post-World War II era, we have immigrants coming over from different Orthodox countries. Ultimately, in the 60s and 70s, lots of immigrants coming over from Greece and Cyprus because of conflicts over there. We have and that changed the Greek Archdiocese. You know, the Greek Archdiocese was on a Americanization, use of English kind of track in the early 60s. That it totally shifted off of that by the time we get to the early 70s. And that's entirely driven, in my opinion, by the waves of immigrants that came, these Greek-speaking immigrants. and they're met by these second, third generation Greek Americans, right? And that created a complexity. You have something sort of similar in the Antiochian setting in America in the 80s. You have a bunch of people coming over from, fleeing the civil war in Lebanon. In more recent times, people coming over fleeing conflicts in Syria, right? In the post-Soviet era, lots of immigration to the United States. So because of these punctuated points of periods of immigration of different groups at different times, what I think that's done is it has made it more difficult. It's not a bad thing. I'm not saying that's bad at all, but it's made it more difficult for there to emerge a kind of homogeneity among us in America, right? That because you always have these people who need to hear the services in their native language or whatever. Does that make sense? I don't know if that makes sense, but I think that's a distinct factor. How do I turn off everyone's microphones? Deacon Andre, I may have to hand it over to you to do it because I don't know how to use this one.
Overheard. Okay, please, everyone turn their mics off because there were unnecessary distractions during Matthew's response. So you please realize that we hear your conversation.
And I think everyone's off at this point.
Okay, all right. So if you need to ask question orally, then just raise your hand in Zoom or send the chat. Okay, thank you.
So I was asked, another question was, I've read that St. Tikhon encouraged Isabel Hapgood in her translation work and they were used by Antiochians. Do I know when these translations were first used in ethnically Russian parishes in the US? The short answer is I don't know off the top of my head the answer to that. I think one of the things that happened, right, was St. Tikhon left America right after the Hapgood translation was published. And so, then he's replaced by Archbishop Platon, who's coming in cold into this situation, right? And he's not necessarily going to have the same set of priorities. I don't know exactly when the Russian churches started to use them, though. Unfortunately, I don't have the answer. I was asked, am I familiar with hieromonk Meletios Golden from Greece coming to America in 1903, who saw the Salvation Army doing the work of the gospel and leaving Orthodoxy altogether and establishing a Greek-American Christian association similar to the YMCA? I didn't know about that. That's news to me. I know of sort of there being other examples of that where you have like Orthodox people becoming kind of missionaries, to their own people or becoming Protestants in this period, but I don't know I've never heard of that specific example. And I was gonna just real quickly, just share a couple of photos from a book that's just been published in Cyprus. This is in Greek. The book's written in Greek. So if you know Greek, this is probably a book you're going to want to have if you're invested enough in American Orthodox history to listen to this. But this book, they have colorized photos at the end of the book of some of the American saints, and I just thought maybe would be worth sharing. This is Saint John Kochorov, Saint Sebastian Dabovic, and Saint Tikhon at that Episcopalian consecration in 1898. There's Saint Alexis Toth. All of these are colorized. Here's Saint Tikhon as a young bishop. He was consecrated, I believe he was 32. I think he was a year younger than the canonical age. So this is when he arrived in America. That's what he looked like. Here he is as patriarch, obviously much older. And here is Saint John Kochorov and his wife. Saint John is a young priest. There's Saint John even before he was ordained to the priesthood. And this is him later on in his life. Here is Saint Alexander Hodovitsky as a very young man. And here he is as a young priest. This is Saint Alexander and his wife. And here's Saint Alexander later on. This is Saint Raphael at the time that he arrived in America. Now this is interesting, right? So Saint Raphael arrives in America. He's got this big curly hair, big beard. And by the time he leaves America, he looks more like that. or not leaves America. He leaves this life. When he dies in 1915. He looks like this. And Saint Raphael. He really like he was a proponent of Americanization. He actually cut his beard. He stopped wearing a cassock in public, and he started to dress with more like a suit. He encouraged. He didn't require his clergy to do the same, but he encouraged it. He had this idea that he wanted to look sort of like an American gentleman. This photo, the top left is Saint Raphael. You can see there. You can see how short his hair was at that point. And then on the bottom row, the second one from the left is Saint Alexander Hodovitsky, and then next to him is Metropolitan or Archbishop, then Archbishop Platon. There's Saint Raphael, and here is Saint Sebastian Dabovic, is a very young man in San Francisco. There's Saint Sebastian. There he is as an elderly man. And this is Saint Mardari. I didn't talk about Saint Mardari. Saint Mardari was a Serbian Orthodox priest under the Russian mission. I believe he taught at the Russian seminary in Minneapolis for a period of time. He ended up becoming the first Serbian Orthodox bishop in America, and there he is later on as a bishop. And he has since been found. His relics were found to be incorrupt, and he was canonized recently by the Serbian Church. And I just want to see, are there any other questions that anyone else has before we, I think we may be done. How was monasticism developed? Okay, so the development of monasticism, the first monastery was St. Tikhon's monastery, which is still around in Pennsylvania. There were not a lot of monasteries in this, like the period that I'm talking about, virtually nothing outside of St. Tikhon's. There was like a short-lived women's monastery that existed under the Russian church. But it was only the Russian church that was doing any kind of monasticism in America at this point. And then as we get a little bit later in the around the 40s, during the period 30s, 40s, during the period of Archbishop Athenagoras of the Greek Archdiocese, later Patriarch Athenagoras, he did try to establish a monastery briefly in North Carolina, believe it or not. It didn't last very long. I wrote about that on my website. We don't really see monasticism developing in earnest until we get to the mid 20th century, the sort of like post World War II, and we start seeing other Orthodox ethnic groups establishing monasteries, particularly the Russian church establishing more. The Greek church starts establishing some monasteries in the 60s. So it's gradual, and we don't really see like the explosion of monastic life until the 70s and 80s. A relative explosion. It still hasn't really exploded. I think we're still way short on the number of monasteries we probably need. Yeah, you know, and I think that's a byproduct of the fact that you had just a bunch of lay people coming over here, and it was an immigrant-driven church, and you know, monastic life was not a priority for a lot of these people. When am I writing? What question was asked? When am I writing a book? I have no plans of writing a book at this point. I don't have the time for it. I've got 5 kids, so Father or Deacon Andre wrote. You just said I learned from Father John Erickson's class that suits were proscribed for clergy by the synod, so that a cultural message that is a Christian minister would be clear. Americans would not know what to make out of a traditionally looking Russian priest. So this is an interesting thing, right? I didn't know about that part, about it being like a requirement, the suits being required. But I do know it's interesting when you look at photos from that early period, and we saw some of them just a minute ago. If you look at the photos of Saint the Russian saints like Saint Alexander Hodovitsky, Saint John Kochorov, they're clean shaven. When they're not in kind of formally dressed, they're often, you'll see Saint Alexander, for example, wearing a suit with a collar. And so the Russian clergy typically were either clean shaven, or they maybe had like a mustache or a goatee or something really tightly cropped beard, and they had a suit often. The Greek clergy, when they would come over, would have these big beards and, you know, big cassocks and everything else. So it's interesting that really sort of shifts in the 20s. We start to see the Greek clergy looking more like a kind of Americanized clergyman sort of look. That emerges really in the 20s among the Greeks. Saint Raphael, you see it during his own lifetime, him shifting from being kind of big beard, etc., you know, cassock, to the short beard and the suit. And you see it with amongst his clergy as well. It's sort of that shift taking place over time. He encouraged Father Nicola Yeni to cut his beard and cut his hair, and you know, and toward the end of late in Father Nicola's life, in the last few years, he did that at Saint Raphael's request. The question you asked, Deacon Andre asked, would I agree that the church life in America still suffers from the impact of the Russian Revolution? I mean, the obvious answer is yes. But like, church life in America is so complex, right? Because you can do a counterfactual, and you could say, well, what if there was no Russian Revolution? Right? If there was no Russian Revolution, I am fairly certain we would still have multiple jurisdictions here, because the Antiochians the Serbs and the Antiochians were already, you know, distancing from the Russian church before the revolution. The Greeks were never part of it. So to my mind, like, you know, it would have saved us a lot of legal disputes, maybe, right? And, you know, obviously, if there was no Russian Revolution, there would probably not be, if there was no Russian Revolution, there would be no ROCOR here. There would also be no OCA, you know, right? Because the whole OCA concept comes out of the revolution and out of the later on, the OCA getting its independence during the Cold War. So, so we would probably have a Moscow Patriarchal Archdiocese here, along with the other jurisdictions that we currently have. So in a way, like, yeah, obviously it had a big impact. A lot of people came here because of that. ROCOR is here, you know, as a direct result of that, right? But at the same time, it's in a weird way, like if you looked from the outside, you'd say, well, yeah, there's still going to be multiple jurisdictions either way. Question was asked, what are the options for the vision of the Church in the United States during this period? St. Tikhon, Antiochian, Western Rite. I don't totally understand the question. St. Tikhon certainly had his vision. It's not clear that any of the other Russian church leadership shared that vision that St. Tikhon had. There's a paper that the future Metropolitan Leonti of the Metropolia wrote in the teens, where he kind of talks about a vision for Orthodoxy in America that's kind of tied in with the use of English and the, you know, kind of emerging Americanization. You know, Western Rite was never a serious sort of end point for, you know, it was always a little bit of a fringe thing. It came in much later than the period we're talking about, and would never have been kind of a core part of a vision for American Orthodoxy. I don't think, even by like Metropolitan Antony Bashir, who was the Antiochian Metropolitan who you know, brought in the Western Rite. And, you know, Antiochian, I don't know what an Antiochian, you know, vision for the church during this period would have been. Like the Antiochians in the period we're talking about would have been very, you know, their own thing, right? They sort of had their own churches. They weren't really thinking broadly necessarily. Even Saint Raphael, who lived above kind of, he was dealing with the Russians all the time. He was dealing with other ethnic groups. It wasn't like Saint Raphael had some plan for American Orthodoxy. I don't know if the person who asked that question wants to clarify. I'm happy to. happy to follow up.
Thank you, Matthew. So 1 minute for more questions, and if there are more questions, we will be wrapping up. Yeah, there is one more, and this is from.
So the question was it inevitable that the different ethnicities eventually separated into their own from a previously more united diaspora society? What would be the best way to manage different ethnicities in the same church? So I think what I was trying to present was that it wasn't necessarily a more united diaspora society. I mean, in a way it was, right? Like, but it was very surface level because the Serbs were getting their priests from overseas and they were managing their own affairs. There was this kind of tenuous official connection to the Russian church, but for the most part, the Serbs were doing their own thing. The Antiochians were doing their own thing. Prior to 1898, the Patriarchate of Antioch had been for about 150 some odd years in what was called, it's commonly called the Greek captivity of Antioch, where they had Greek patriarchs, ethnically Greek, controlling the church, despite the fact that the majority of the population were Arabic-speaking Syrians, okay? So it was during that Greek captivity that St. Raphael joins the Russian church, and that's why he comes over as part of the Russian church. Once the Greek captivity is good, once the Antiochians are able to elect their own native patriarch, Meletios Doumani, in 1898, at that point, St. Raphael is now, he goes from being persona non grata in the Patriarchate of Antioch, seen as this like rebel, to being seen as like the favorite son of Antioch, right? And so St. Raphael has this, from that point on, this close relationship with Antioch and in a correspondingly complex relationship with Russia. So when he's consecrated in 1904 by St. Tikhon goes and gets a blessing from the Patriarch of Antioch to do the consecration. He does the consecration. St. Raphael gets his consecration documents and everything from the Russian church. He's clearly a bishop of the Russian church. And yet at the same time, he says he's a bishop of Antioch also. Like, it's really ambiguous. And that's 1904. So I think it's like, it's probably a little bit of an anachronism to say, and I think it comes out of a much later period of historiography to look back and say like, oh, things were super united back then. I don't think they were. I think there was some surface level official stuff, right? But I think it was pretty chaotic, even in the period we're talking about. So yes, I think it was inevitable that there were multiple jurisdictions. The crystallization into multiple jurisdictions was probably inevitable. What would be the best way to manage different ethnicities in the same church? I think St. Tikhon's vision probably was the best anybody could have come up with, right? Because it wasn't like you were going to have, he understood that like if you have hundreds of Russians and Greeks and Serbs and Syrians in a city, they're going to be broken into their own churches, right? And that they need people who speak their language, et cetera, et cetera. So when you're talking about first generation immigrants, the first people to come here, it's almost inevitable they're going to need special care. So a kind of vicariate model is probably the way that you almost have to go. As the Americanization, starts taking place, there's more homogeneity that can come in, right? There's more, everybody's using English, intermarrying, et cetera. But what I was trying to point out earlier was because you have so much of these waves of immigration, it essentially hits the reset button for each of these groups. Each time there's a new wave of immigration. So the Greeks were on this Americanizing track until you hit the 60s. And then all of a sudden you have all these Greek immigrants to America. And then it essentially hits the reset button on Greek Orthodoxy in America in some ways, right? And now they to this day are still sort of struggling with this question of ethnicity. I think if they hadn't had that immigration wave in the 60s and 70s, it may not be as big of a deal. It may be that they would have been more, kind of integrating, because that was the track they were on up until you get to the 60s. When do we start? The question is, when do we start seeing widespread concerns expressed about overlapping ethnic jurisdictions in the U.S.? My understanding of this is that we start seeing it in the mid-20s. Efthymios Ophaish, who I mentioned earlier, he was one of the claimants to be the leader of the Antiochians after St. Raphael died. He was eventually consecrated a bishop by the Russians to lead the kind of pro-Russian faction of Antiochians. He later on, sort of post-revolution, Russian Revolution, and all these things, he goes off and forms something called the American Orthodox Catholic Church, and it's in that sort of context that he and some of the convert American clergy around him start expressing, as I recall, a kind of concern about, hey, we should all be under one jurisdiction. I don't know if he actually, even he then was saying we should all be like territory, there shouldn't be overlap, right? Because like St. Tikhon's model is overlap, right? I think everybody has always understood overlap is almost an inevitability. I don't know that you know, this idea of like it's uncanonical to have multiple bishops in the same city kind of idea comes in much later. I don't know exactly the historiography on that. And Father Andrew Dabovic just sent me a message. He did his MDiv thesis on Efthymios Ophaish, and he said Efthymios' own vision included overlap. So even Efthymios, who's trying to push some somewhat visionary stuff a little bit ahead of his time, he's still thinking overlap. I mean, frankly, even the OCA, the concept of the OCA incorporates overlap, right? They have, and they always have had, ethnic jurisdictions within the OCA. So you have the Romanian Orthodox Episcopate that encompasses all of North America, right? And so, like, I live in on the West Coast in southern Washington State, and in the Portland, Oregon area, there are churches under Archbishop Benjamin, the OCA bishop of San Francisco in the West. And there are also churches under Archbishop Nathaniel, the Romanian Orthodox bishop under the OCA, right? So the OCA itself in the same city has churches under different bishops, right? So even that model, I mean, it, you know, is sort of, and you see the same thing, by the way, with the Ecumenical Patriarchate. There's the Greek Archdiocese, but the Ecumenical Patriarchate also has a Ukrainian jurisdiction. They have a Carpatho-Russian jurisdiction, and there's an Albanian jurisdiction that has 2 parishes or 3 parishes or something, right? So even there, right, they still have this model of overlapping jurisdictions. Yeah, and somebody else just sent a message, you know, the Moscow Patriarchate and ROCOR is similar. I think that's a little complicated just because of historical circumstances. It wasn't like the Moscow Patriarchate was going to dissolve ROCOR when they sort of reunited. So I think the Moscow ROCOR thing, but you're right, Moscow does have multiple jurisdictions here. Plus, at least on paper, they acknowledge that the OCA is an autocephalous church, which raises all kinds of other issues. So yeah, I think that the ideal has never really been a realistic outcome up to this point in church history in America.
Well, it seems like from 11 to 1 was a reasonable choice. We're almost there. And I would like to thank everyone who has been with us today, and from as far as Spain to Indonesia. So Reader Sergey is here. I know him. And it was, thank you for your enthusiastic participation. And thank you again. I learned a lot, and I didn't ask some questions because when I was about to ask them, you already answered them. So thank you so much. It was very good, and a lot of food for our soul. Thank you, and please continue with your website and your studies, and hopefully maybe we will meet again like that. In
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.